So good afternoon everyone. This afternoon we're going to discuss about the language transfer and language transition in the K-12 curriculum and its principal processes and practices. So the driving force of this section is to respond creatively and constructively to the urgent need to make a decision as regards the appropriate language transfer and language transition in the context of mother tongue based multilingual education, or the MTB-MLE of the K-12 curriculum. So the Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013 RA 10533 states that for kindergarten and the first 3 years of elementary education, instruction, teaching materials, and assessments shall be in the regional or native language of the learners. The Department of Education shall formulate a mother tongue or mother language transition program from the grade 4 to grade 6 so that Filipino and English shall be gradually introduced as language of instruction until such time with these two languages become the primary languages of instruction of the secondary level. In as much time as grade 4 to 6 are still in the elementary level, it can be inferred that English and Filipino are not yet considered the primary language of instruction, or LOI. It is construed that some subjects in the elementary level, particularly in the said grades, should still be taught using the mother tongue as the language of instruction. So, in implying that the number of subjects taught in the mother tongue decreases during this period. So, let's define about transfer and transition. So, transfer, it is a scientific concept that explains how we learn language, and it is based on Benson C. in 2008. And transition is an educational term indicating the point at which the medium of instructional shift from one language to another. So it is clear that the transfer is different from transition. Transfer is a cognitive process where what is known in the mother tongue, or L1, can be transferred to L2, while transition involves an approach to MTB-MLE where teaching shifts from L1 to L2 as a language of instruction, or LOI. So let's talk about the components of bridging program. So Malone 2012 identifies 6 general components of bridging programs which capture the principles of both language transfer, or the components 1 to 5, and the language transition, which is the component 6. And number 1, continue to focus on oral L1, especially for ages 8 to 10. Focus on using the L1 for higher level thinking, listening, and speaking. Number 2, introduce literacy in the L1 and build fluency in reading and writing meaningfully and correctly. Number 3, introduce and build fluency in the oral L2. Note that oral L2 can be introduced early as long as it does not interfere with small children's oral and written L1. Development is in non-threatening, enjoyable, and fun. So begin with listening and responding to commands in L2. And later, add some speaking in L2 and gradually build fluency in using everyday L2 for a variety of communicative activities. So number 4, introduce and build fluency in written L2, remembering that children will be able to transfer their understanding of the reading or writing process from the language 1 into their language 2. Number 5, continue teaching and oral written. which is in L1 and L2 as subjects at least to the end of the primary school. And last is use language 1 as the only language of instructions in early grades and use both language 1 and language 2 for instruction in middle to later primary. Let's now talk about the transfer primer in L1 to L2. So language learning materials when L1 and L2 use the same alphabetic script. So Malone 2022 recommends that transfer primers are used for introducing the L1 writing system when both L1 and L2 use the same script. So transfer primers usually follow a progression as given following below. So number 1, symbols like letters and other features of written language that look like the same sound in both language or same letter, same sound. Just for example, the Tagalog M, in English it's also M. So it has a same letter and also same sound. And number 2, new symbols in the L2 that represent sounds that are also in L1 and it is called new letter or new sound. Number 3, symbols that look the same in both language but represent different sounds in L2. Such it is called same letter and different sounds. For example, English letter A has a different sound as A. A are controlled. Number 4, symbols that look different in language 2 but represent sounds that are also in L1. Combination of letters but different in sound. For example, letters PH are sounded as F, which is also in L1. And lastly, symbols that represent features of the L2 are number 5, symbols that represent features of the L2 that are not present in the L1, just for example, the tone, stress, and voice quality. Just for example, the aspirated PT and K in English, but not any of the Philippine language. So here is some suggestions for developing a transfer primer from Malone 2009. So first, do a frequency count to produce a list of L2 letters from most frequently used. Number 2, select the sounds that can be taught in each lesson based that frequency count to least frequently used. You can use the following order to teaching sounds in the transfer primer, which is the same letter or same sound for 10 or more per lesson. New letter, new sound, 1 per lesson. New letter, familiar sound, 1 per lesson. Same letter, different sound, in 1 per lesson. And new letter combinations, new sound, 1 per lesson. And also, you can give equal attention to consonants, vowels, and diacritics. And lastly, you can use the guiding principles. Include the vowels and consonants in each lesson. Teach letters that look similar but are not separately. Teach new letters with similar sound separately. And teach short and long vowels, examples O and U, separately. Then 3, choosing keywords to teach the language 2 letters. So in number 3, each keyword includes the new letter that is in focus in that lesson. If possible, the new letter is at the beginning of the keyword. And the keyword relates to something very familiar to the learners. And it can be represented in a simple picture that the learners can recognize. And then lastly, it is composed of letters that have already been learned plus the one new letter that is being learned in that lesson. Number 4, in suggestion, creating sentences and stories using newly learned L2 letters. So create a short, meaningful language to sentence that uses the new language to letter plus others that have been learned. And when the students have learned enough new letters, add a short story for each lesson. Then produce a large numbers of graded language to storybooks about familiar topics, and starting from very short and simple to longer and more complex. So let's now talk about the transition models. So transition in MTB MLE or bilingual programs begin teaching and learning in the mother tongue or L1 but shift over time or L2. The following are the language transition model. First is the transitional early exit models. MT or L1 is seen only as a shortcut to the L2. There is a short-term oral use of the L1 at preschool and or early primary levels, and developing L1 literacy skills over 3 to 4 years before transitioning or switching or changing the language of literacy and instruction from the L1 to L2. So these models are considered as the weakest model. Next, let's talk about the transitional late exit models, and it is considered as the strong foundation and bridge of the L2 or the language 2. These MTB MLE transition models teach MT or L1 as the subject and use it as the language of learning for 6 to 7 years, and these are just like what I said a while ago. It is the strong MTB MLE models. And next, the additive or bilingual education model. MT or L1 is used as a language of instruction or LOI throughout the entire period of basic education side by side with other language of instruction. So the objective of these models, three models, is the use of mother tongue or L1 as the medium of instruction throughout with the official of foreign language taught as the subject, or to use the MT plus official or foreign language as two or dual medium of instruction right through the end of the schooling. So the MT is never removed as a medium of instruction and never used less than 60 or 50% of the subject. These are the strong MTB MLE models according to UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning in 2010. So language transition models by Agatha van Ginkel in 2012. So below, it is the illustration of the transition models as presented by Agatha van Ginkel of SIL International Africa area. And this transition model is adapted from Agatha in 2012. Need for different transitional late exit models in the Philippine schools. So language diversity and linguistic situations obtaining in the country necessitate as a language transition program that allows the use of the different models which are appropriate to the school, provided that the model adopted is not restricted and is research grounded. Clearly, as stipulated in RA 10533, the language transition program promotes the late exit model. As indicated in the said model, the process of transitioning cannot begin before learners have a strong foundation in the mother tongue or in L1. Shortcut in language transition means taking away from the MT or language 1 at an early age, resulting in the collapse of the foundation on which learning is built. So one guiding principle of the MTB MLE that is based on international research is the acceptance of the established evidence that children normally requires 5 to 7 years of second language learning before they can academic subjects through this language exclusively. So this is because it takes time to learn a new language. So there are no shortcuts. Learning the L2 may start with basic communication skills, but these are also enough to support the high-level thinking and learning. So thus students' learning becomes more successful if they learn L2 as a subject while using L1 as a language of instruction. In short, there is no abrupt transition to language to instruction after only 2 to 3 years in school. So next, it is all about designing MTB-MLE transitional late exit model. So based on research in language and education in African countries, the following table presents a triangle option of MTB-MLE program with one or more strong national languages or wider communication plus an instructional language of wider communication. So the L1 is called first language, L2 is the second language, the L3 is the third language, MOI or the medium of instruction, NLWC or the national language of wider communication, and ILYC is the international language of wider communication. So last is the proposal to revise DepEd orders on mother tongue. So on the basis of the principles that underpin the MTB-MLE program in the K-12 and as mandated by Republic Act 10533, DepEd Orders Number 3 of 2012 and Series of 2013 have been revised. Principles of language transfer and transition dictate that children should ideally continue to study the mother tongue of L1 at least a subject and if not, a teaching or learning medium throughout their schooling cycle. So for grades 4 and 6, transition models need to consider the gradual instructions of Filipino and English as language of instruction or learning. Sudden removal of the MT or L1 as LOI will be disadvantageous to the learners. Filipino and English during this transition period should not be taught as in bilingual education program which has been proven ineffective. So, the use of the L1 as LOI shall continue until at least grade 6. Thank you. This is Kisa Anjoy Fortes Coriani from Bachelor of Elementary Education, Block 201.